I hope I am being broadcast to you all. Excellent. Well, thank you so much for having me today. I'm very excited to be here digitally with you from London. And I know that sometimes these digital presentations can be exhausting. So I really hope that I can provide you with lots of inspiration. I'm just getting my presentation up. Okay, let's get going. So my name is Leyla Acaroglu, and I'm a designer and a sociologist. I am deeply passionate about using design as a catalyst for social and environmental change. And that's meant that I've created lots of different tools and resources to help people think differently about how we solve problems in business, in government, and of course in our daily lives. This idea of using design is something that I want to liberate right from the start. Design is not just something that professionals use in order to create beautiful spaces or websites that work. It's actually something we do every single day of our lives. We all design our experience of the world. We figure out how to, operate in complex times. We design our lifestyles. But also we're citizen designers in the choices we make, the way we interact with the economy. All of the things we do in our day-to-day lives, they have these invisible, far-reaching impacts on the rest of the planet. And that's really what we're here to talk about today. For my work, I was named Champion of the Earth, which I must admit, I was quite surprised when I received the phone call. But that was mainly for my work at using design and innovation and sustainability as this driver for creativity and change. There's some great free resources that I've had the pleasure of being commissioned to create that I thought that some of you out there might be excited about, especially anyone who works in education. One is on the circular classroom, where we designed this for the Finnish education system, creating an entire online learning system with videos and downloadable PDFs and workshop activities around systems and sustainability and creativity and innovation. And you can grab this anywhere and use it anywhere in the world. And then I was also commissioned by the United Nations to design a project that helps anyone, anywhere, think differently about how they live their lives so that they can live a more sustainable life. And what I came up with that was this idea of, every day we take actions with our hands. And so these are our anatomy of actions. We can do things with them. We have these impacts around our lifestyle choices of the food we eat, the way we move around our cities, the stuff we buy, how we have fun. And in each of these different lifestyle areas, food, stuff, move, money, fun, we have the ability to make better choices. So just take money, for example. One of the quickest and easiest ways you can make change today would be to divest your banking and energy providers from companies that aren't doing sustainability. You can call them, you can ask to review their environmental action plans or sustainable corporate social responsibility, whatever they have. You can quickly see if they're actually taking action. Do they have a climate policy? And then if they're not, change them. And this is the power of making good choices. And I think that for those people here listening who are interested in, community action that has big level change, not only are these actions important for us to do individually, but it also is great for us to share with our community the types of choices we make. I personally transferred all of my bank accounts to ethical banks. Took a little bit more time to find them, but I must admit I have a great quality of service and I really find it is very empowering. So in order to help people think differently and design solutions, I also created a school for adults called the Unschool of Disruptive Design. We used to pop up all over the world running programs, face-to-face immersive experiences for adults around systems change, sustainability, and design. Now we do a lot of that digitally, surprise, surprise. But we are also really excited by the fact that we have tens of thousands of people who have come through our schools and programs all over the world and helping to activate in their local community change. That's my personal goal in my career, is to agentize people, to give people the tools that allow them to make change in their community. And to really understand that all problems hold their own solutions. I am such a proponent of this idea that we can love problems, just like if you were to go on a date with your problem, you would be intrigued to understand what makes it tick. If we really truly understand how the complexity of the problems around us work, what's their inner kind of operational things ticking along, the more empowered and agentized we are to actually come up with solutions that will help address them. And of course, we know that one of the big challenges that we have right in front of us is climate action and climate change. And I think with the COVID crisis, it's even brought to more awareness to people just how first of all, how quickly things can change, as we have seen, but also how easy it is for us to reconfigure society. I think that that's been one of the most fascinating things about this transformation. So climate change is something that's been upon us for a while. The scientists actually started talking about this quite a long time ago, but now the impacts of our actions are really hitting us very, very the face. And obviously with the tragic fires that are burning in California, and in January we're in Australia, and last year was in Europe, we are seeing that the climate change is upon us. And the thing is that climate change is not just taking an airplane flight or driving your car. Carbon emissions and climate impacts are embedded in everything we do, like the internet. So now we've all moved our lives digitally. And of course, that does mean that we're not taking those transportation choices like we used to. But the internet has a physical footprint, because every time you upload a photo or you do a Google search, energy is required to power servers, many, many servers. And servers, because they're like computer brains, they get hot. And that heat then has to be cooled. So you have this incredible energy requirement that is actually creating a physical footprint on the planet as a result of us all turning to our digital lives. In fact, it's actually considered around 3 to 4% of our global carbon emissions are attributed to the use of the internet and digital communication. But the thing about this, like climate change, it's also having major impacts on things like the jumping of zootropic diseases between animals, wild animals and humans. So Harvard University came out right after the COVID crisis first kind of hit and showed that there was relationships between the rise in temperature, the movement of animals in ecosystems, as well as ecosystem destruction that was supporting this kind of rapid increase in these zootropic diseases, jumping species. So here's the thing. We understand there are lots of problems, and my job is not to tell you all about the problems. It's to tell you about the opportunities we have in redesigning them so we have a better future. So the issue, though, that we must address is the fact that we've created this linear economy. We've unintentionally, in the last 75 years, created a very strong economy based on continual economic growth, directly linked to consumption, that goes to nature, extracts all these resources, processes them into usable goods, sells them to you or I, and then we have the responsibility of what to do with them at the end of their life. We are involved in the waste part of this cycle, but the decisions were made by the designers or the company and about what the product was, the materials and the processes that mean that we may or may not be able to recycle it, reuse it, repair it. And so ultimately this linear economy, these design and disposal ends are the things that the circular economy is trying to bring together. We're trying to take this area where we think about how we create goods and services that make a value in the economy, and how you or I are ultimately responsible for dealing with the end of life. Because one of the most tragic things about waste is that we, as citizens, we bear the cost of dealing with waste. We pay for waste removal, landfilling, incineration, and recycling through our local government taxes. And that, to me, seems to be inherently inequitable, because we didn't make the decisions about how the product was designed, and a lot of the time we don't actually understand how whether or not something is recyclable or it is repairable. So herein lies the problem. We have this linear economy, we've gone to nature, we've gone and grabbed all of these resources, we've processed them, but then we have this issue where those resources, nature wants to take them back. Nature has, by its very design, regenerative. So it takes resources and it turns them into the building blocks for life. But we've gone and created all of these extremely complicated materials that don't get biometabolized or kind of absorbed back into nature the same way. And if you look at any of our major resource streams, whether it be energy or wood products, you can clearly see that when you take them out of nature, that there is always going to be some element that gets put back in the form of pollution. And waste is a form of pollution, as is air pollution, water runoff, even noise pollution. And actually, it's funny, I didn't think about noise pollution as being a major issue until I read about, what's happened to the dolphins and the marine life as a result of less sea activity, when we were all in lockdown. So they were kind of like had a great party because they didn't have to listen to all of the human-made noise pollution under the ocean. So nature by its very design is regenerative. And I think that is a brilliant model to try and replicate. And here's the thing. design is this very powerful force that most of us are actually not really thinking about in our day-to-day lives. It's this silent social scripter that influences how we move. You know, those of you who are old enough to remember, you might remember cellular devices that you actually had to use your finger or your thumb to text with. And in those days, all those years ago, there was these scientific reports that people's thumbs were getting longer because they were texting so much. Well, now we have this problem called tech neck, where people are so kind of in this position so frequently using their cell phones that their necks are actually starting to change. And if you talk to a chiropractor, they'll tell you all about the problems that they're now experiencing as a result of these physical changes. So our experiences of the world, whether it be how a city is designed, a website, the government's voting, for example, all of those influence how effective we are at actually living healthy, sustainable, and regenerative lives. Let's just take one example, since I'm talking about cell phones and we all have them. So aside from the significant environmental impact associated with the mining of the minerals and metals that go into our cellular devices and the reduced lifespan that they will have because of planned obsolescence, which is a whole other problem, one of the fascinating things is the way in which the user experience is designed and how that influences your eye's brain. So there's this thing called dark design or dark patterning, which is where UX designers can manipulate how you interact with the website based on using some basic cognitive science. And you might know that there's been recently some different movies and kind of controversies around this, but like the guy who developed the little notification button that appears on any app, he actually doesn't let his kids use any apps because he knows how addictive that is, because he was responsible for deciding that it would create this kind of reward mechanism of dopamine, and we would get addicted to these systems. And this is part of the problem, is that if we're addressing sustainability, we're essentially addressing the relationship between meeting human desires and meeting human needs and the impact of those needs and desires on the planet. So I like to define this as value. Ultimately, anything that's created and sold in the economy that you or I go and spend our money on is about getting some sort of value. It might be delicious food, it might be just basic warmth, it might be to make ourselves feel good. But nonetheless, the things that are created to give value to somebody. But our system, our linear economy, devalues things very quickly after they're created. So they're often created, especially like single-use products, to have this very short lifespan and then be completely devalued. So we've kind of maximized this idea that everything should be novel, it should create a sense of status or prestige, but we don't value the thing that gives us life, which is nature. Our entire economic system does not value in any way, shape, or form the services provided for free by nature. And so unless we redefine what we value as a society, as communities, as individuals, then unfortunately we'll probably keep exploiting nature. And so this is really where this power of designing the way we interact with the world, the goods and services that move through the economy, and designing our own lives. Because the one planet that we do have, it has limits. We know that there are limits to how much a system can be disrupted before it collapses. And really, that's what the older idea of sustainable development, developed in the 80s, was really about trying to solve. This idea that we can't have continual growth on a finite planet, that we need to have some sort of checks and balances on our businesses and governments and daily activities that help us understand the cause and effect relationships of our actions. Now, for me, sustainability is a great goal. It's a pathway to regeneration. Just like equality is a pathway to equity. We need pathways to get us to our destination. And for me, the idea of considering the economic, social, and environmental impacts of what we do in our own lives, in the jobs that we have, is about really understanding that everything that exists will always stay on the planet and has to cycle through some sort of system. And that's the key thing here, thinking about systems. So everything goes through the economy in some way. And the idea that we have with the circular economy is to maximize the value that things have as it goes through. Now, let me give you some examples. One that I think we all share a delight for is food. So food, and food waste specifically, is a problem. Because of the amount of land that is cleared and transformed in order to produce food, the inputs such as chemicals and fertilizers, the runoffs, and of course food waste. Now, the UN calculates that a third to half of all food produced is wasted, but 40% of that is actually from us, from the home. And if you think about it, you're always throwing some sort of food waste out, whether it be the tops of the vegetables, the moldy bread, or, you know, the takeout that stayed in the fridge for too long. And if you calculate the fact that a large percentage of the global carbon emissions are attributed to the production of food, when you waste food, you're not just wasting that piece of food that you can't eat. You're actually wasting the other piece of food or that piece of land that was required to then grow the new thing that you would need in order to get that sustenance, because humans need a particular amount of sustenance to sustain ourselves. So if you understand this relationship between choices and the kind of, like, I imagine this like invisible spread out into the wider economy. So when you throw out something that you no longer need, somewhere someone has to go and plant a vegetable to replace that, or grow a cow. And let's talk about meat, because that is one of the biggest ways that we can reduce our ecological footprints. We can help solve climate change is by changing our food systems. So now, I don't think that eating meat is inherently bad, but I think factory farming is a travesty on the planet and on the ethics of animals. And in the US, up to 99% of all meat products are actually produced in factory farms. Now, the reason this is such a problem, other than the fact that, you know, there's ethical issues for the animals, is that cows don't eat soy usually. Cows eat grass. And what happens is, in these kinds of factory environments, they have to go and grow significant amounts of food. In this case, a large part of the Amazon is cleared in order to grow soybeans, not for vegetarians like me, but for meat eaters, because they need to fatten the cows up in order to kill them to make meat. And now the issue with that is that you have that big impact on the Amazon, but you also have this big impact on eutrophication. And eutrophication is basically poop. The simplest way to explain it. A lot of animals in one location, they have a lot of poop, and that poop often escapes into the natural environment and runs into waterways and kind of conglomerates in certain parts of the oceans. And the thing about poop is it's not nitrogen. Nitrogen is a food source for, so I'm getting really nerdy on you all here. I hope you've had coffee. Nitrogen is a food source for different organisms. And so organisms that then flourish, and there's these particular organisms, they suck oxygen out of the ocean, and there's all of these now dead zones all around the world, hundreds of them, where the ocean is actually devoid of any life because of this. And now the reason that's a problem for us, other than, you know, fish and all the rest of it, is that most of our oxygen comes from the oceans. 50% of our oxygen, if not more, comes from photosynthesis by phytoplankton. So for us, it's really important that we protect all these systems, because we all need to breathe as well as eat. But what this also represents is that waste is part of our culture. We've ultimately created a culture where waste is normalized, be it food waste or packaging waste or whatever else, cell phones. And it's entirely invented. Waste was not really a thing other than organic waste. Like, obviously, people have pooped for the whole of humanity. And the kind of products that we are now wasting are so complicated that they've really resulted in a crisis. I mean, we heard in the introductions the mention of ocean plastic waste. But what I find fascinating is that if somebody tries to imagine that ocean plastic waste doesn't affect them, micro and macro pieces of plastic, then they just need to see studies like this one that talk about how, I mean, it was only 8 people, but most of us are pooping out plastic pieces because most of our salt is contaminated with microplastics. And so the thing is that nature is trying to always metabolize things, even if it's plastic. And so it's putting it in different places, and it's coming into our bodies. And ultimately, we are part of this big system. And the one that we have designed, heavily creating waste, is inherently flawed. It's flawed not just because we lose value, but also because it affects us in negative ways. In our hip pockets, as I said, we have to pay for waste to be removed, but also in our health and well-being. So in nature, there's no such thing as waste. There's just values that are recycled. Yet we've designed a lot of things to be disposable. And this is because we've created an economy that essentially is based on the idea of extraction and exploitation. And this, my friends, all comes down to the wonderful invention of gross domestic product. So just a little history lesson here. After the Second World War, there was a meeting that happened in upstate New York, and there were some decisions made about how to measure the rebuild and success of the nations after the tragedy of 2 bloody world wars. And gross domestic product, which had been developed by a guy called Simon Kuznets in the 1930s, had been basically a very simple tool to understand whether or not the US had enough resources to not only recover from the Great Recession, but to also go to war. And so he created this really nerdy accounting system that just looked at how things within the borders of the country were being produced and consumed. And so that gave them the knowledge to go ahead and participate in the war, and to also create this accounting system that became the gold standard, and now globally we use it. Now, the issue with gross domestic product, or GDP, is that it has these things called externalities, and externalities are basically things that are not measured in the system. So the entire natural world is not measured at all in our economic modeling, at all. So there is no value associated to a tree staying in a forest. There's only value associated to the cut tree going through a lumber mill and being turned into a product. But equally, the thing about externalities is that the people who are affected by an externality, the people who are affected by the runoff of sewage or by the forest being destroyed, they are generally not the people who created the externality to begin with. And this is where the inequity of this system really starts to play out. So a linear economy, which GDP is based on, does not account for any services provided by nature. We do not have any understanding of how valuable oxygen is. Therefore, there is no economic incentive to ensure that we don't create air pollution or perhaps destroy, the oceans and prevent our ability to create crisp, clean oxygen, which I breathe 17,000 times a day, and I absolutely love. I love fresh oxygen. I don't know about you guys, but the times I have had in my life where I have not had fresh oxygen, I have really suffered. And so ultimately, this whole idea of measurement in a very reductive way, which, as Simon Kuznets, the inventor of GDP, said himself, does not measure welfare. It does not understand the benefit of society at all. It's extremely reductive. And so he said that it's not a great way to actually determine the success of nations. So GDP, though, here is this thing that every country in the world measures, and we talk about a healthy economy being based on GDP. But what we don't account for is also all of these social values that are so important to us, like raising children, completely not included. All of you homeschooling these days, you are not accounted for in gross domestic measurements. The sale of secondhand goods, completely ignored. Caregiving, the concept of freedom. These things are not measured, therefore we don't value them. And to me, that's one of the travesties of the situation that we're in. There are many alternatives that look at creating different models, and at a local level, globally, especially in the US, we're seeing a lot of adaptation of these types of indexes that measure human welfare and well-being alongside economic development. And of course, the New Zealand government have recently said that they will use these types of metrics to determine their own health and well-being as a whole country. But what this is talking about is that in order to address sustainability, we also need really significant cultural shifts. And that has to do a lot with how we perceive the world. Humans are a wonderful hot mess. Our brains are extremely complicated, and we are riddled with fear and emotional reactions to triggers that tell us whether or not we're safe or if we should react with violence. The human brain, most of our processing is actually done in this pink bit in the limbic system, which I'm sure you're all familiar with, this idea of fight or flight, the fear response that we get if you, say, encounter a snake. I'm from Australia. They really kill you there. So I have quite a fear of snakes. And we have this visceral reaction to these experiences. See, the thing about this is that most of our memories are held in the limbic system. And so it's often that information comes in, it triggers some sort of response, and then we act. And most of our decision-making is done in that part of the brain, not in the conscious part. And so combined with things like cognitive dissonance, where we think we're going to do one thing, but then when we encounter a different experience, instead of changing our actions, we just change our mind. And the idea that our brains are actually making a lot of decisions for us in order to make it more efficient and effective for us to kind of navigate this complex world we live in. And cognitive biases, it means that we have a bit of a mess going on when it comes to figuring out how to overcome some of the barriers to making positive social change. Positive change that people are actively participating in and that they are not being manipulated. So here's the deal. Every human has a set of cognitive biases. There's hundreds of them. They're culturally shared. I call them brain glitches. So for example, confirmation bias. You would have this if you are Googling and there's information that you doesn't really reinforce what you already believe, what you'll do is you'll just skim past it. And that's all, remember, subconscious decision making. So it's harder for you to actually access information that is different to what you already believe. And thanks to AI as well, we're all just getting fed the same information over and over again. But our brains are also enjoying being told that we're right. There's another bias called the Dunning-Kruger effect, so named after the behavioral economists who actually identified it, which says that when people are confronted with information when people they think they know a lot about something, so they have this very high opinion of their knowledge, so they avoid very actively any information that would discredit their belief that they know a lot about things. Just have a think about that behavior, because I feel we could think of some people who have that in the world. Now, that's also combined with the fact that we have these dual negativity and optimism biases at play. So negativity bias, as it sounds, is basically we don't like things that are bad. Our brain actually gets more attached to them. It has a bigger impact, but therefore it holds our attention longer, and it has a weightier effect on our brains. So, you know, Facebook did some really controversial research a few years ago where they manipulated people's feeds, and they found that emotions were contagious, but that people reacted more when engaging with negative information than positive. And the optimism bias, though you might think it sounds like, well, we just prefer optimistic ideas, that is not the case. It's actually that the human brain has to protect the rest of the body. And so when we imagine any of these huge catastrophic or potentially life-threatening issues, be it climate change or another pandemic perhaps, that it's general that our brain will imagine the solution for us being okay. It will have more likely be optimistic about our ability to get out of the problem than negative. So as a general rule, we have this kind of like false projection about the future to protect ourselves, yet at the same time, we're all like addicted to negative information. So as I said, human brains, kind of hot mess, but also fascinating and wonderful. We don't like to waste money. We have a double loss. If we lose something, it has double the cognitive impact to the gaining something. But at the same time, we've also created a culture where it's very easy for us to waste things. So we don't like losing things that we perceive as having a lot of value, but we really definitely don't want to waste things that we've invested a lot of our time and money in. And this also comes down to the other factor about us humans, is we are incredible social animals. We love our friends and family, as I'm sure we're all experiencing now, the importance of those connections. So that means that we are always influencing people around us. And it's through this that we actually look to kind of prove what is appropriate or not appropriate in society. So ultimately, if we have more people participating in the, you know, sustainable lifestyles and living and circularization, then we're going to have more uptake. So we've seen this, back to my food example, with alternative meat products. So the biggest IPO in the last few years was Beyond Meat, the fake meat company. And there was just a ruling in the European Union a few days ago to say that, you know, non-meat-based meat products can be called as such, because peanut butter is still not butter, but we understand the concept, because there is such a huge increase in the consumption of these types of products, not just because there's cultural shifts towards this, but also because there's health and well-being aspects, and people are more and more aware of the environmental and social impacts of the factory farming conundrum. So here we have a lot of these issues at play. And the way I like to describe it is that this value shift that we need to have in order to address sustainability and to activate positive change is we need to have it at multiple levels. But you or I, most of us, although I'm sure some of you work for government, we are just living our daily lives. So how does the circular economy and this transformation of the way things move through the economy come into our lives and ultimately have an end of life, how does that affect us? Well, every action we take has an impact. Everything we do, whether you like it or not. Sometimes more challenging than we originally thought, and sometimes less. And the reality is that when we look at the circular economy, we don't have a lot of what we say agency over every element of that, right? So a lot of people are not the designers or the producers of that product. So we have to make informed decisions in other areas of our lives to get that agency, but to also invest in the types of products and services that we want to see more in. So for me, one of the most powerful things is to understand that the circular economy is really trying to encourage this idea of absorbing materials and resources back into nature. And so, as I said at the beginning, like everything that's ever existed, that's been processed and produced still exists in some way. It's just been broken down into the molecular forms and, re-metabolized by the natural world. So the idea is that if we can figure out how to design products like these fancy technological items to go back through a specifically designed technical cycle, and we can also design to metabolize all of the natural materials like food waste, and we can use food waste to create methane, and methane is an alternative fuel for producing energy and power and gas, then we can make sure we rebuild soils and add soil fertility. So the idea conceptually is brilliant. It just says, okay, let's just funnel everything in these different channels, create really incredible technological solutions for taking things back. But there's still some issues with how we're going to execute this. And so that's why a systems perspective is so important. Understanding how the world works and how the way we perceive what's going on will affect how we end up creating a future. So this is a concept called the iceberg model, which is that for most of us, we see the most obvious part of the system. But really what is driving what we see is connected to our mental models or the social values of the time. And so that's why I think one of the most empowering things to do if you are a dedicated, passionate person about cultural renewal and sustainability and a positive future, then you need to disrupt your own way of thinking about the world. Because unfortunately, we do all suffer from cognitive biases. And one way of doing that is to overcome our linear mindsets and to start thinking in a more three-dimensional way. And the tool I use for this is my perspective shifting tool. So imagine if you looked through a telescope, you could see the infinite possibility of the universe, right? Pretty overwhelming. And then if you go to a microscope and you look down through that, you would see, a little tiny square of glass with maybe a drop of water and lots of little microorganisms running around. But the image inside the microscope and the image inside the telescope are just the same pattern repeated in different scales. And that's the way the world works. That's the way nature works. It's like patterns are repeated. And so when we understand that this infinite possibility and this micro world are connected and they're similar, we're given the tools to think differently about our role in the middle of this beautiful, complex world that we are all blessed with living in. So this idea of transitioning from our own linear mindsets to a circular mindset requires systems thinking, which fundamentally is about the fact that everything, absolutely everything is interconnected in some way, shape, or form. Just as I take this breath and I require photosynthesis to provide the resources for my lungs to suck in the oxygen and exhale the carbon dioxide, which then is taken up by my delightful tree life in my house. So this relationship building is really one of the key tools for thinking differently about the world and then participating in it differently. And, in my work, I'm very blessed to be able to work with, some CEOs of some of the biggest companies, the United Nations, as well as governments around the world and individuals. And systems thinking is the unifying tool for understanding the complexity, but to be able to find solutions that truly work within the systems around us, because that's the thing. We live in systems. We are a system. My body is made up of a bunch of complex systems. And so by understanding those obvious parts of the system and how they connect, looking for how we can see the whole as well as the parts versus just seeing the parts. So the silo mindset is often quite problematic, and looking to synthesize and emerge new ideas out of the system that we exist within. It's all built on our ability to understand relationships. And that is the thing, as humans, we know is so important. It's relationships. And so we can transform the way that the world works, the way that we design products and services, and how we ultimately live and flourish and thrive into the future by changing the way we design the world. And so for me, this is really powerful. We can all be designers of a positive future by changing our perspective today and making sure that the solutions we come up with don't end up being tomorrow's problems. So I just want to say that, there's a lot of good intentions and they don't always lead to good outcomes. So being able to see that there are lots of opportunities for transformation and not just have that kind of one-dimensional viewpoint is part of this transformation that we can all go through in helping to solve some of these complex problems. And I'm just aware of the time, so I'm going to wrap up there so that we have some time for Q&A. And yeah, I'm happy to answer any questions that come along. Great. I am seeing some questions, so let me see if I can grab them. Stage. Aha. I am operating the technology. So Alison is asking about what the most effective slogans and buzzwords are. I would say that, what's really important is that people connect to the problem. And the problem here, as I think I've tried to iterate, is that it's really a combination of how we created an economy, but then how we participate in that economy. So, we designed this problem set and we can also solve it. And so if you look at something like ocean plastic waste, which I know is a huge issue for a lot of people, especially coastal communities, it's really important to see that it does connect with people. But the bigger issue here is that we've designed a disposable culture. And so we need to go for like that ambitious outcome and have lots of steps and stages in the process to get into this post-disposable world. And so the circular economy's helped create that framework. And I think the US is a little bit slower in adopting the circular mindset. In the European Union, where I am, basically, there's national legislation and every country has their own policies. And of course, we are, signatory to the Paris Agreement. So there's a lot more general dialogue and conversation about this. But I think that there is a lot of strength in maintaining clear narratives. So sustainability is a pathway to regeneration. The circular economy is transforming the wider economy to fix these externalities so that we can have a prosperous future that helps everybody, no matter what you believe in, politically or ideologically. So being clear and bringing everybody on the journey is really important. Thanks, Danielle, for saying that I'm better than coffee. I have been caffeinated myself just to make sure that through this 2D screen, I could give you some energy. Okay, so question from Katie. It says, how are organizations like Sustainability Accounting Standards Board and other helping us better account for externalities and or develop more relevant metrics than GDP? Okay, well, there's a number of different propositions around alternative GDP models. So some from the UN, some from independent organizations. And in my personal opinion, I don't think there's anything necessarily stand out or bad about any of them. There's so many great things about all of them and then some deficits. So it is a bit of a complex space to know what's going to be the most effective. I think that we should always turn to nature as a model, and nature is diverse. And diversity is one of the kind of key concepts of the circular economy too. Like, we have to create diverse solutions to things, not just monolithic or one-dimensional ones. So I think that, the US, for example, it's a different culture to, Asia. And the same with, I grew up in Australia and I've lived in, many countries. And every time I live somewhere different, I experience all these different cultures and the diversity of the human experience. So I feel like the GDP model needs to be adapted so that we account for the externalities to start with. Like, that feels like the first thing we need to do at a global level, whether it be through the United Nations or be through individual leaders coming together. That is one of the key. Anymore. Oh, going back. Did you lose me? Am I back? Woohoo! I'm back. Excellent. I can't remember where I was, so I'm just going to answer another question then. So someone's asking, if you do eat beef, they're suggesting some great produce, which is excellent. I always say quality over quantity. It's a great personal life method. If you have a desire to eat certain things, then make sure that what you are investing in is high quality, and you can really help with local producers, grass-fed, products as well. So someone's asking about the metrics or accounting for the circular economy. Well, okay, so I'm a big proponent of life cycle thinking, which is a scientific method for understanding how things that move through the linear economy have interact with the natural world. So that tool, which has got an ISO standard, and then it helps kind of understand like the pros and cons of different materials or processes, but it also tells us that king. So if you are designing that's produced in, say, France, it's going to have a different carbon impact than it being produced in Canada or Australia because of the energy mix. And that also changes very, very quickly. Like globally, we've seen the price of solar drop astronomically. So now coal's being phased out. You know, you had BlackRock, the world's biggest investing firm, basically tell all of its companies if it doesn't address climate change, it's not going to invest in them anymore. So coal is being heavily divested in right now. So I think that for me personally, and not everybody agrees with this, I think a circular economy from a business side of things needs a form of accounting, a metric accounting system like life cycle assessment or a hybrid of such with the ecological footprint methodology. But data is important, and especially from a government or a business perspective. One of the things I wanted to share, but I ran out of time, was actually I've developed this new model to help businesses address the operational product and experiential impacts of the things they create. Because over the last few years, I've been doing a lot more work with these kind of pioneering industries that are interested in transforming the way they interact with the world and produce circular products. And what I've seen is that starting off can be quite intimidating, and needing some sort of framework to move forward in that is really important. So if you're interested, I have lots of free resources and stuff at my school, the Unschool, so unschools.co. And if you want to hit me up on Twitter, I can always share the links and things with you. But for me personally, I do think that a metric is really important. But a lot of the time, what government or business do is they get their own metric development system made, whether it be ecological footprint or a hybrid of input-output data. But yeah, it's quite technical. Okay, I don't know how much time I have left. Let me see. I can see there's so many great questions going on in here. So I hear how many people, well, someone's asking about Fortune 500 manufacturers and what they're doing to transition to the circular economy. So I just want to say, maybe I can just very quickly, I think I have like 2 minutes left. If I just very quickly jump ahead, if the organizers can just give me a little message about how many minutes I have left, because I just wanted to show you, there are a number of strategies that you can employ. So there's sustainable design strategies at the design level. And then there's also these concepts around moving towards a post-disposable society. And then there's all of these business model transformations. So you can basically integrate into existing models how to basically change cultural conditions around the products and services that we create. So there's lots of different models. I'm just flipping through them because I have like 30 seconds left. Lots of different examples like the loop system from Unilever. And this is what I was saying about the idea of the different channels of change that organizations can make in order to green their internal operations, create sustainable products that are part of the circular economy, and design better experiences. And on that note, I'm going to say goodbye and hand over to the brilliant William McDonough. So thank you so much for having me. I hope I triggered some little brain cells, having a little dance party up there for the rest of your wonderful experience together with this wonderful event. So thank you all so much.